Have you ever wondered what really drove Imperial Japan to launch one of the most devastating surprise attacks in modern history? Were they emboldened by unbreakable confidence, provoked by unrelenting pressure, or compelled by circumstances beyond their control? Today, we will take a deep dive into the complex motives, the intense negotiations, and the simmering global tension that led to the day that forever changed the course of World War II. The story of why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor is more than just a narrative of bombs, battleships, and strategic gambles. It's a vivid chronicle of ambition, desperation, and the high stakes of global power struggles. Stick around as we journey through the events, unravel the secrets, and finally shine a light on the unseen factors that set the stage for this catastrophic moment. Welcome, history enthusiasts and curious minds, to a comprehensive exploration of one of the most pivotal moments in the 20th century. On December 7, 1941, the tranquility of a Sunday morning in Hawaii was shattered by the piercing whine of airplanes and the thunderous roar of explosions. What led Japan, a nation with centuries of rich tradition and a vibrant cultural identity, to orchestrate an event so deadly that it would push the United States into World War II? Was it a straightforward act of aggression, or the result of a complex brew of political, economic, and strategic factors that left Japan feeling cornered and desperate? Today's in-depth look will trace the evolution of U.S.-Japanese relations, delve into the resource dependencies that drove imperial ambition, reveal the strategic calculations behind Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's daring plan, and explore how diplomatic failures sealed the fate of two great powers on a collision course. Join us for this extensive journey as we piece together the mosaic of events that culminated in the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. In order to understand why Imperial Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, we must first step back several decades to examine the growth and transformation of Japan as a global player. The seeds of conflict began long before the bombs fell in Hawaii. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Japan emerged from centuries of self-imposed isolation and embarked on a path of rapid modernization under the Meiji Restoration. By modeling elements of Western institutions, adopting advanced military technologies, reorganizing its governmental structure, and fostering industrial growth, Japan quickly joined the ranks of the great world powers. Yet Japan was a nation with limited natural resources, and this reality would increasingly define its foreign policy decisions. At the turn of the 20th century, Japan's imperial ambitions grew. Its campaigns in Korea and Manchuria, culminating in conflicts like the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, revealed a newly assertive Japan ready to challenge established powers. By the 1920s and 1930s, Japan was well on its way to forming an empire spanning East Asia. The appetite for resources, oil, rubber, iron, and tin, especially from territories in Southeast Asia, became an urgent priority. Domestic pressures demanded continued economic expansion to support a growing population and further industrialization. With China destabilized and Southeast Asia rich in raw materials, Japan saw an opening to solidify its status as the dominant power in the region. However, this aggressive expansionist policy was not without consequence. The United States, among other Western powers, viewed Japan's moves in Asia with growing alarm. American interests in the Philippines, as well as its broader concern for maintaining an open trade system, clashed with Japan's imperial goals. Moreover, the United States had deep-rooted relations with China, where Japan had been waging war since the early 1930s. The tension escalated significantly in 1937 when full-scale hostilities broke out between China and Japan, an event widely viewed as the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Reports of brutal tactics employed by the Imperial Japanese Army, including the infamous Nanjing Massacre, outraged global opinion. Consequently, the U.S. ramped up its economic pressure on Japan, culminating in trade restrictions meant to curb Japanese aggression. For Japan, these escalating tensions posed a substantial dilemma. The more the United States clamped down on exports and froze assets, the more Japan felt backed into a corner. Oil was a critical lifeline for Japan's modern military machinery, powering ships, planes, and tanks. By the late 1930s, Japan imported a significant portion of its oil from the United States. When the U.S. imposed an oil embargo in 1941, the ramifications were immediate and dire. Japan's stockpiles would last only so long, and without a new source of oil, the entire imperial war machine would eventually grind to a halt. From Japan's perspective, the decision to strike was increasingly framed as a choice between slow strangulation under American economic measures and a bold gamble to secure the natural resources of Southeast Asia by force. Yet the question remains, why attack Pearl Harbor instead of focusing solely on resource-rich territories like the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya? The strategic blueprint for the Pearl Harbor attack was influenced heavily by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, one of Japan's most brilliant naval strategists. Yamamoto believed that if Japan was to seize the resources of Southeast Asia without interference, it would need to neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet, the most formidable force capable of impeding Japan's planned conquests in the region. Pearl Harbor, located in Hawaii, was the main base of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, a critical staging area for American naval operations in the Pacific Ocean. By delivering a crippling blow to the U.S. fleet right at its Hawaiian stronghold, Japan hoped to delay America's ability to project power across the Pacific, thus giving the Imperial Japanese Navy the freedom to seize vital territories in Southeast Asia, secure oil and mineral resources, and fortify a defensive perimeter around its newly acquired empire. Central to this plan was the element of surprise. Historically, the United States believed that any Japanese assault on American territory would more likely be in the Philippines, closer to Japan, and well within striking distance. Pearl Harbor, located roughly 4,000 miles from Japan, was widely perceived as too distant a target for a successful large-scale attack. This assumption became one of the great vulnerabilities. Moreover, diplomatic negotiations between the United States and Japan continued right up until the day of the attack. The U.S. believed that negotiations could at least prevent an immediate military conflict, while the Japanese government, behind the scenes, was already putting the finishing touches on Yamamoto's audacious plan. Another factor influencing Japan's decision was the Tripartite Pact, signed in 1940, which allied Japan with Germany and Italy, collectively known as the Axis powers. Although the direct effect of this alliance on the Pearl Harbor attack is still debated, it provided Japan with a safety net of sorts. With Germany embroiled in a massive conflict against the Soviet Union and Western Europe, and Italy fighting in the Mediterranean and North Africa, the Japanese leadership believed the United States might hesitate to fully commit its forces in the Pacific. The reasoning went that the U.S. could find itself fighting wars on two major fronts, against Germany in Europe and Japan in the Pacific, potentially stretching American capabilities thin. Despite these calculated risks, not everyone in Japan's leadership was convinced the attack on Pearl Harbor was the optimal strategy. Some high-ranking officials worried that a direct confrontation with the United States would awaken a sleeping giant, especially given the industrial capacity and economic resources of the Americans. Admiral Yamamoto himself is famously said to have warned that Japan could only guarantee about 6 months of successful operations before America's vastly superior production capabilities tipped the scales. Nonetheless, with the embargo choking off resources and tensions mounting daily, Japan's War Council ultimately resolved to move forward. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the first wave of Japanese fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes roared out of the sky in a carefully orchestrated strike. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, taken almost entirely by surprise, suffered catastrophic losses in terms of battleships, aircraft, and personnel. The USS Arizona was famously sunk, and multiple other vessels were severely damaged. Yet crucially, the American aircraft carriers were not present in the harbor that morning. They were out to sea conducting exercises. This oversight would later prove a decisive factor in the Pacific War. The short-term success of Japan's strike was undeniable, but it also catalyzed a united American public and government to declare war, plunging the United States into the global conflict with renewed vigor. Now, to truly understand why Japan took such a gamble, we must also consider the cultural and psychological backdrop. In Japan, the Bushido Code, an ancient samurai ethic emphasizing honor, loyalty, and bravery, permeated the military's mindset. Coupled with nationalist propaganda that championed Japan's divine right and destiny to rule East Asia, these values fostered a sense of invincibility. Leaders perceived the Western powers as decadent and weak-willed, believing that a swift, decisive blow could force them to negotiate on Japanese terms. This perspective, however, underestimated America's capacity for mobilization and resilience. Moreover, the failure of diplomatic talks between Japan and the United States deserves special attention. Throughout 1941, both sides held numerous discussions in the hope of preventing outright war. The United States demanded that Japan withdraw from China and respect the territorial integrity of neighboring states, while Japan insisted it had a right to expand its influence in Asia. Neither side was willing to compromise on core interests. The oil embargo tightened the noose around Japan's economy, and as the final talks stagnated, the more hawkish factions in Tokyo saw an attack as the only solution. A point often overlooked is Japan's broader strategic calculation regarding the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, and Malaya. These territories were prime targets due to their abundant oil and rubber. Yet the Japanese High Command worried that any movement in Southeast Asia would provoke immediate retaliation from Western powers, particularly the United States. By eliminating the threat of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Japan hoped for a freer hand to sweep across Southeast Asia without American interference for at least several months. This strategy was momentarily successful. Simultaneously with Pearl Harbor, Japan launched attacks on Hong Kong, the Philippines, and Malaya, capturing crucial territories in the weeks that followed. However, the long-term ramifications were far more costly than Japan's leaders had anticipated. One of the most frequently asked questions is whether Japan could have avoided war with the United States altogether. Hindsight suggests that, while tensions were extraordinarily high, there may have been fleeting chances for diplomatic breakthroughs if either side had been willing to give ground. However, the ideological divide, compounded by Japan's immediate resource crisis, made compromise difficult. American policymakers saw Japan's occupation of neighboring territories as a direct threat to international law and U.S. interests. Japan, in turn, felt that Western powers were deliberately encircling it and denying its aspirations to be recognized as a top-tier world power with a legitimate sphere of influence. Any attempt to paint Japan's decision to attack Pearl Harbor as purely logical or solely the product of expansionist greed would oversimplify a complex historical puzzle. Indeed, the Japanese leadership was caught between powerful factions. On one side were the militarists and nationalists, who believed in the empire's destiny to dominate Asia. On the other were more moderate voices, which cautioned that war with the United States could spell disaster. Emperor Hirohito often appeared as a distant figure to the public, But behind closed doors, he was far more involved in military decisions than once assumed. The emperor was informed of the plan for Pearl Harbor, yet he did not veto it. This fact remains a pivotal aspect of the debate on individual responsibility within the Japanese government. The United States' response to Pearl Harbor was swift. President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his famous Day of Infamy speech on December 8, 1941, asserting that the unprovoked attack demanded immediate and full retaliation. Soon after, the U.S. Congress declared war on Japan. In turn, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, thus drawing the Americans fully into World War II on both the European and Pacific fronts. The conflict would escalate into a global confrontation of unprecedented scale, involving massive land, air, and sea battles that spanned continents and oceans alike. As time passed, the initial tactical victory that Japan achieved at Pearl Harbor turned into a strategic liability. The American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, among others, escaped harm on December 7th. These carriers would become the nucleus of America's counterattack in the Pacific, leading to pivotal battles such as Midway in June 1942, where the Imperial Japanese Navy suffered catastrophic losses that it never truly recovered from. Thus, Pearl Harbor, aimed at securing Japanese dominance in the Pacific, instead sparked a fierce American resolve that, within just a few years, would culminate in the island-hopping campaigns, the firebombing of Japanese cities, and ultimately the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Another angle worth exploring is how the attack on Pearl Harbor affected Japan's standing among Asian nations. While Japan initially positioned itself as the liberator of Asia from Western colonialism, the brutal methods used by the Imperial Army in many conquered regions eroded the notion that Japan's expansion was purely an anti-colonial struggle. Indeed, many local populations soon realized that Japanese occupation was hardly an improvement over Western colonial rule, sowing seeds of resistance and complicating Japan's ability to consolidate its newly gained territories. If Japan had targeted resource areas without attacking Pearl Harbor, the United States might have found it more challenging to rally domestic support for a war. But by striking American soil, Japan effectively guaranteed that American popular opinion swung decisively in favor of a total war effort. It is also valuable to analyze the intelligence breakdown that occurred within the United States. In the months leading up to December 1941, there were indicators that Japan was planning some type of action. Intercepted communications, codenamed Magic, gave hints about an imminent strike, though the precise location and timing were unclear. Many U.S. military and political leaders assumed the blow would fall in Southeast Asia or on the Philippines, which led to Pearl Harbor being insufficiently prepared. The complexity of military intelligence at the time, combined with bureaucratic inefficiencies, contributed to the success of the Japanese surprise. From Japan's perspective, attacking Pearl Harbor was both a symbolic and practical move. Psychologically, delivering a massive blow on America's own soil aimed to shock the American public and possibly force the United States into negotiations. Militarily, it was intended to buy time for Japan to secure its resource objectives in Southeast Asia. Though the short-term results were stunning, the ultimate failure lay in underestimating American industrial potential, national resolve, and the strategic importance of aircraft carriers in modern naval warfare. Pearl Harbor, therefore, stands as a pivotal lesson in how surprise attacks can yield immediate success, but trigger long-term defeat if the adversary's underlying strengths are misjudged. Let's explore the mindset that led Japan into a corner. By 1941, Japan's economy was under significant strain. War in China was dragging on, consuming vast resources. The occupation of French Indochina earlier in 1941 further strained relations with the United States. Each new move Japan made seemed to bring about harsher American economic sanctions. With time running out on critical supplies, the talk in Tokyo was that a decisive action was necessary to end the stalemate. Diplomacy might have worked if cooler heads had prevailed, but powerful voices in Japan's military ranks felt that negotiation was pointless unless Japan had a strong bargaining chip. A crippling strike against the U.S. Pacific Fleet was envisioned as exactly that, a demonstration of Japan's might, intended to force the U.S. to consider a negotiated settlement more favorably. The reality, of course, played out very differently. International geopolitics also influenced Japan's risk calculus. Germany's early successes in Europe, defeating France in 1940 and pushing deep into Soviet territory in 1941, suggested to Japanese planners that Germany was on track for eventual victory, or at least a stalemate favorable to the Axis. If the Soviet Union collapsed under the German invasion, Japan might not have to worry about its northern flank. This scenario emboldened those advocating a southern advance for resources. Though this perspective oversimplified the complexities of the European war, it contributed to the climate of overconfidence in Tokyo. Japan overlooked the possibility that the Soviet Union could withstand Germany's onslaught, just as it underestimated the American capacity to rebound after Pearl Harbor. The lead-up to the attack was also marked by the final stages of diplomatic talks. Envoys from Japan and the U.S. held multiple rounds of discussions in Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, coded messages to the Japanese embassy in Washington indicated that hostilities would begin if negotiations failed. There's a notorious historical controversy over whether Japan should have issued a formal declaration of war before the attack. A portion of the Japanese message that might have served as a declaration was delayed in translation and never formally delivered before the bombs fell. As a result, the U.S. viewed the attack as not only aggressive, but also duplicitous, fueling even greater outrage among the American public. In examining the broader context, we see that the Pearl Harbor attack was just one prong of a massive coordinated offensive that swept across the Pacific. On December 7th and 8th, depending on the international dateline, Japanese forces also bombed American bases in the Philippines, landed in Malaya, and targeted Hong Kong. The scale of this operation was enormous. Japan aimed to seize the resources necessary for sustaining a long war, constructing what it called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Pearl Harbor was, in many ways, the linchpin of this entire strategy. Without neutralizing the U.S. Pacific Fleet, the southern operations might have been precarious, especially if American battleships and carriers sailed to disrupt Japanese supply lines and landings. Yet, as with many wars, the strategic landscape shifted quickly. Despite the initial shock and awe, the United States rallied faster than Japanese planners anticipated. American shipyards began churning out new vessels at an unprecedented rate. Thousands of pilots were trained and new aircraft produced. Public support for the war effort was overwhelming, driven by a sense of moral imperative following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Industries converted from civilian to military production, turning the American economy into an enormous war machine. The momentum would eventually swing decisively in favor of the Allies, culminating in a hard-fought, island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. In the end, Pearl Harbor stands as a sobering reminder of how miscalculation, desperation, and ambition can collide on the global stage. Japan's reasons for attacking Pearl Harbor were multifaceted: a desperate need for resources, a strategic calculation to remove the U.S. fleet as a barrier to conquest, a belief in the moral right to expand, and a frustration with American embargoes and negotiations. But the attack also showcased the peril of underestimating an opponent's industrial and moral capacity to wage war. Though the Japanese military achieved short-term tactical success, the broader outcome was an unwinnable war that led to immense destruction on both sides and ushered in the nuclear age. This, then, is the epic story of why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. It's a tale of ambition colliding with necessity, ideology intersecting with strategy, and diplomacy failing in the face of encroaching war. From Japan's desperation to secure resources and break free from perceived Western encirclement, to America's resolve to defend its interests and uphold a vision of global order, the decisions made in 1941 reverberated around the world and altered human history in profound ways. As we reflect on these events today, we're reminded that every choice on the international stage, especially in times of intense pressure and high stakes, can unleash ripple effects far greater than anyone can predict. May the lessons of Pearl Harbor continue to guide our understanding of conflict, negotiation, and the power of national will, so that such tragic miscalculations can be avoided in the future. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of World War II's most transformative moments. If you found this exploration enlightening, share your thoughts and consider subscribing to stay updated with more historical exposés. Remember, knowledge of the past helps us comprehend the present and shape a better tomorrow.